All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is our third episode of the Montana Functional Health Community Q&A. And last week we focused on the immune system and its key influencers. And if you guys missed that episode, you can find it on our website. So that's at mfhcare.com. And it's actually on our blog. So you just look in there under the About section, there's blog articles, and you can go in and you can review those. They're also on our YouTube channel, which just would be searching Montana Functional Health via YouTube. So yeah, check out the last couple episodes if you missed them. So Heather's going to start us off.
Yeah, again, thanks everybody for joining us, especially on these sunny, warm days. I want to just introduce us again tonight. I'm Dr. Heather Maddox, co-founder of Montana Functional Health, and it's always a pleasure to be joined by Lindsay Peterson, co-founder of Montana Functional Health, and Heidi Moretti, founder of the Healthy RD. So tonight we're going to review how the health of our gut regulates our immune system. We're going to discuss the inner relationship between these two systems, what happens when imbalances occur, and the incredibly important influence food has on this delicate relationship. Let's go ahead and get started by exploring the interconnection between the gut and the immune system. We have about 25 feet of intestine in our body, and the area of the small intestine alone is enough to cover a tennis court. Essentially, the inner lining or mucosa of our gut is directly exposed to the external environment. It sees all sorts of structures, including commensal or good bacteria, dietary particles, and viruses at far greater numbers on a daily basis than actually the immune system sees in a lifetime. It is critical that this lining is healthy and has the necessary tools to manage this incredibly important and busy task. Because of this dynamic, about 70% of our immune system is located in the GI tract and is a major line of defense. There has to be some way to monitor what is happening in the intestinal tract and support the gut in its efforts to process the external world we are exposed to. It's no surprise that the largest lymph organ in the body is actually in our gut and is called GALT, or gut-associated lymphoid tissue. The immune system has to be educated by the environment so it can be tolerant and not react to everything it sees. This occurs predominantly in the gut. We develop a healthy tolerance if we are exposed to more diverse organisms, especially in the first 2 years of life. Doing things like washing dishes by hand, buying food directly from farms, and eating fermented foods can help. It is so important that the immune system be able to differentiate all the substances it is exposed to as either friends or foes and not confuse the two. I want to briefly discuss a key immune player in the gut called secretory IgA. It is the most abundant antibody along the gut wall, and it gets released to the surface of the intestinal lining. When it does so, it binds to and neutralizes potential pathogens and other proteins before they cross the barrier. This can be measured on a comprehensive stool analysis and can serve as a window into whether there are imbalances in the gut. Production of this increases in the presence of harmful organisms and allergenic foods. If levels are low, then our protective barrier can be impaired and compromised. The gut also has its own nervous system. Once thought to be dormant, we now know that is not the case. One of its jobs is to help regulate our immune system. To try to visualize what is going on this front line, let's think of the gut lining as a wall or a fortress. The cells in the intestinal lining are tightly packed, but there are some openings to allow for small food particles, vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients to pass through. Also, some bacteria and viruses do pass through as well. The inside of the intestinal tract, or lumen, is essentially the outside world or environment, with all sorts of visitors passing through. These can also be food particles, debris from organisms, toxins like alcohol, and byproducts that the liver has broken down, to name a few examples. The immune system is lined up behind this intestinal lining like guards, monitoring what is coming through and deciding whether these things are safe to pass into the bloodstream or not. If something is not deemed safe, it is tagged for destruction and a local inflammatory response ensues. Ideally, you don't want this to happen often, or at least be limited when it does occur. We face significant consequences to our health and well-being if our gut becomes dysregulated. Our gut bacteria play a major role in maintaining a healthy, tolerant immune system. Chronic systemic immune activation is the strongest predictor of disease progression and is rooted in alterations in the microbiome. Let's now get a better understanding of perhaps what some feel is the most important system in our body. The human gut microbiome is the most complex ecosystem ever discovered in the universe. It consists of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and viruses to the tune of trillions. The bacteria in our gut outnumber our cells by a factor of 10 to 1. There are 150 times more genes in the microbiome than in humans. We are our microbiome. These gut bacteria maintain the balance of our entire system. As we talked about last week, we want a certain level of diversity so that all of the species are well represented, balancing each other. Think about a garden. The more plants you have, it prevents weeds from having the space to grow, or at least makes them more manageable. If your plants die off and you have more open space in your garden, weeds are uninhibited and start to take over. This can happen essentially in the gut. Diversity is highly specific to each individual, and it's influenced by how we are born, whether we are breast or bottle fed, the foods we eat, toxin exposures, antibiotics, stress, and so on. Composition of the microbiome can shape a healthy immune response, or it can predispose us to disease. Small shifts in the microbiome, for example, like an unhealthy diet or antibiotics, can reverberate throughout the entire system. Our microflora, or microbiome, are a significant part of defense against infection and protect us in several ways. When they feed on healthy fibers or prebiotics, they make residues that help protect the gut wall barrier and keep it intact, almost like glue. They also provide resistance to colonization of potentially pathogenic microbes. An example of this is C. difficile that can occur after being on an antibiotic. When we take antibiotics to get rid of an infection, unfortunately, there is collateral damage and loss of some of our good bacteria. Think of that garden analogy: keep weeds under control by having enough plants. Gut bacteria influence our nervous system, which can directly impact immune function as well. What we eat is the main factor that influences the population of bacteria that inhabit the gut. Eating a SAD, or standard American diet, that's low in fiber and high in fats and carbs is a major cause of dysbiosis or imbalances in gut bacteria. Eating too much sugar tends to promote the overgrowth of yeast, which can cause low-grade inflammation and a whole host of symptoms. I want to mention again the influence of antibiotic use and what it does to the microbiome, especially early in life. After one typical 7 to 10 day course of antibiotics, it can take 3 to 6 months, or 3 to 12 months actually, for the microbiome to recover. Imagine a child receiving 2 to 3 courses of antibiotics a year in those first few years of life. In some instances, the microbiome never recovers. Other factors that can influence the microbiome are chronic constipation, stress, and medications. For example, if you take a medicine like Prilosec, long-term, coupled with chronic constipation, this can put you at risk for developing SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that Lindsay mentioned last week. The take-home message here is that imbalances in our gut bacteria can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation. This has significant implications in inflammatory diseases like allergies, asthma, inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis, and obesity, to name a few. The health of the microbiome plays a large role in the concept of leaky gut. I am now going to let Lindsay talk more about leaky gut and the implications it has on our immune system and development of chronic disease.
Thank you. Yeah, like Heather said, last week we talked about gut health and inflammation, and I introduced the idea of leaky gut, or intestinal permeability, promising that we would cover it this week. So leaky gut is a term many people are throwing around these days, and I want to explain just the gist of it so to help you better understand the process of how and why it's actually a problem. So I'm going to talk you through the leaky gut process, so just bear with me on this. But basically, if we think about our fingers, so there's normally these happy little microvilli that are lining our gut. They're floating around. And between these microvilli are tight junctions that allow some smaller food particles to purposefully move through and enter our bloodstream. This is how we absorb nutrients that our bodies need. But when our gut is exposed to a trigger food, and let's say that's gluten, maybe it's dairy in some people, it can actually cause inflammation of the gut wall, and it can swell. And so when our gut wall becomes inflamed and swollen, those tight junctions actually loosen up, and then bigger food particles can move through when they should not. So our immune system sees these larger particles, and they recognize them as foreign invaders, and this mounts an immune response to them. And when these inflammatory foods or foods that we're sensitive to are consumed regularly, it creates a vicious cycle of inflammation. This process eventually causes more damage to the gut lining. And so when that happens, certain foods we normally can tolerate seep through the tight junctions and are eventually identified as invaders. This continues to increase our immune response and causes our immune system to go haywire, actually. So this happens when, let's say in celiac disease, for example, we eat the trigger food, which is gluten in this case, and we are not realizing that we're maybe allergic to it or we're sensitive to it. This causes a lot of inflammation and eventually leads to intestinal permeability. So this process is why we see a lot of autoimmune diseases occur. And autoimmune disease is a huge problem. It's the third leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the industrial world. In fact, 8% of the United States population, which is 24 million people, live with an autoimmune disease. And over the last 80 years, the incidence of autoimmune disease has actually continued to rise. So examples of autoimmune disease, and Heather mentioned some of these, is rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's, endometriosis, psoriasis, Hashimoto's, thyroid disease, celiac, just to name a few. And DMARDs and biologics are medications that are used regularly in conventional medicine as treatment for autoimmune disease, but they haven't been a great answer for this epidemic. So they're expensive. They're not always covered by insurance. They carry unwanted risks and side effects, and often they just stop working for people. So in modern medicine, we just have to get better at looking at the root cause of disease. Like, why is someone's immune system overactive? What is the trigger for that specific person's immune system to be hyperactive? This is why we focus so heavily on trigger identification in functional medicine, because our goal is to identify and address the root cause for disease. We know that autoimmune disease triggers some of them are at least stress, nutrient insufficiencies, toxins, trauma, infections, and food. And while some can reduce the incidence of autoimmune disease as far as foods go, we've also learned previously that some foods can actually cause autoimmune disease. And then again, that goes back to the idea of leaky gut. So this process actually happened to me personally. I actually have a gluten allergy. I didn't know it for the longest time. And during that period, I suffered intense migraines, painful periods. I dealt with IBS symptoms, and I started to just feel really bad overall. I had fatigue. My thyroid started to get attacked in an autoimmune response. So through my own research, I realized that these were not normal symptoms, but I could never find a conventional answer as to why I was feeling this way. And so I ended up continuing to research myself and found functional medicine. And I embarked on my own 6-month journey to try to figure out what my triggers were for why I felt so bad. And I eventually started with food sensitivity tests that showed that I was sensitive to many, many foods. And this was clue number 1 that I had something pretty big going on. I followed that with an elimination diet that I did for a few months. My elimination phase was 3 to 4 weeks. And I ended up during that time getting results of my comprehensive stool analysis, which showed that I had a pretty inflamed gut. I had an immune response going on. I even had microscopic blood in my stool. And at this point, I had not reintroduced anything for my elimination diet. So a couple weeks later, we did some more repeat stool tests for those markers that were so off. And I ended up finding out that my colon was actually healing. And there was no more inflammation. There was no more immune response. Blood was gone. So it really showed us that I was reacting to some type of food. I ended up strategically reintroducing foods over the next few months. I took it pretty slow, but I did okay through the process. And at the end of 2018, before I actually reintroduced gluten, which I had saved for last, I repeated my stool test again and found out that everything was normal. My gut was totally healed. So the picture there was incredibly clear that I was suffering from a gluten allergy. And what was super interesting is that on my food sensitivity test, it actually didn't show that I was reacting to wheat, but it did show that I was reacting to barley, which is a gluten grain. So, you know, we didn't know at the beginning that I was actually having a reaction to gluten, but eventually it just proved that it was. So, and, you know, I realized that we could have probably also done a test for celiac, but it just wasn't something that we actually didn't think of it, given my symptoms. It wasn't something that we jumped to, but I also realize now that even if we had done one, there's false negatives that can happen. So we basically, I would have had to do the same elimination diet and reintroduction phase anyway. So it didn't really matter. And I'm just so pleased that I found functional medicine that just because I feel like, you know, $1 million now. And really got my life back. But yeah, I just wanted to share that with you guys just because it's a really tried and true example of leaky gut and how it sort of led to an immune response, but how I was able to identify my trigger and then reduce that response in general, and just get myself back to feeling normal again without constant inflammation causing a number of symptoms in my body. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, and she can talk a little bit more about foods and kind of how they influence the immune system.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lindsay. And the talking about the foods that affect the microbiome, and it's pretty simple, like you're talking about, foods that can really enhance our microbiome and immune function, and foods that can take away from it. So the three I want to really mention are fermented foods, as Heather talked about, fermented foods, fiber foods, and then also, you probably hear my dog in the background trying to get in. So anyway, the fiber and then fermented foods and sugar. So those three, and so first I'm going to get into a little bit about fermented foods. Fermented foods have a strong role in helping heal the gut because they have three components to them that are really important for gut healing. And that is it's probiotics that are formed from the fermentation process, and it's digestive enzymes. It's a really unique component of fermented foods is that they make digestive enzymes. So that's another component of why they help us heal our gut. And then also we have in those foods these pre-digested starches, or the carbohydrates begin breaking down. So it eases digestion, it supports the healthy microbiome, and it provides us with enzymes. So it's really, really a symbiotic type of foods we can eat. And so fermented foods are great. And then next is having fiber. Most Americans are really short on fiber these days. We want to have 25 to 35 grams. And so that means with most meals, we really want to focus in on high quality fiber foods in our diet, especially soluble fiber, because the soluble fibers help to feed the healthy bacteria. It becomes like their fuel, the microbiome fuel. They help release the nutrients for these bacteria. So fiber foods that are specifically high in soluble are things like apples, apple pectin, chia seeds, flax seeds, sweet potatoes, certain kinds of other things, vegetables are like Brussels sprouts, broccoli. You can get some from certain kinds of beans as long as you tolerate them. I recommend getting them in the form or sprouting them, and it's super simple to sprout. You just want to soak. I highly recommend getting into sprouting. It's a super simple step you can take to make foods more digestible and also better for your microbiome. And then when we look at some of the most obvious things that you could stand to cut back on is sugar, and that's a really hard one for a lot of people because sugar is very tasty. It makes foods pleasant. It's foods we turn to with stress. So with sugar, you can cut back a number of ways. You can do it gradually, or you can cut back cold turkey. I'm the type of person who does best just not having it around the house much. But to deal with sugar cravings, you can have things on hand that are naturally sweet, like fruits. You can have spices like Ceylon cinnamon. You can enhance the flavor with things like just a touch of honey, natural honey, a little bit of stevia. Also, you can use a new one that's pretty good tasting. It's called monk fruit. It's not new, but it's new on American markets. So there's a number of ways to cut the sugar back in the diet and without suffering, and filling up on good proteins. To take a step back, the sugar really does cause the wrong bacteria to grow. So really they're causing the bacteria that trigger more susceptibility to bad bacteria, to infections, contributes to leaky gut, like Lindsay talked about. So the foods that you really want to, again, have is more fermented foods, more fiber, and less sugar. So with that, I think, are we ready for questions now? And
yeah, I
okay,
think
great.
we're kind of at the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, just throw them in the chat box. We're going to just jump into some questions that we did get through email. So we're just going to start with those until other questions come through the chat box. So I guess it's kind of on the heels of what you were talking about, Heidi, so we might as well jump into this. But so one question that came through, and I'm just guessing you're going to talk about this because it's your forte, but what are the best probiotic foods you recommend?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The fermented foods that are my favorite are sauerkraut, and I like to make my own. It's really easy. I can fill you in on how. I love kombucha, and then I also love kimchi. And so there's a lot of really good ways you can even just say, take your carrots from your local farmer's market, cut them up, put them in a little bit of like a brine, throw in whatever spices you like, and you just let them sit not airtight on your counter. And any kind of crunchy vegetable like that works really well. You can make a pickle like that. And the natural flora on these healthier grown vegetables they thrive. They make the probiotics thrive. So any fermented vegetable is my very favorite. If you're not really into that idea, you can start out with like a non-dairy yogurt, like a coconut yogurt. You kind of have to watch out for sugars with some of those, but I do like those too as a nice alternative. So those are my favorite natural foods that have probiotics.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds great. Okay, and then there's another one that's kind of on the same wavelength, but what probiotics do you recommend? So obviously we get probiotics in food, but I think what this person's asking is what, like, actual probiotic tablets or pills, or I guess you can get it in many forms, but it's just asking what probiotics do you recommend? So I think I'm just guessing that person's asking more about specific ones that you can take as a pharmaceutical kind of way to replenish the gut. Heather, do you want to mention something about that?
So it can be very confusing. I mean, all you got to do is even just go to some of the local stores like Good Food and Natural Grocers, and there's whole shelves of probiotics, some refrigerated, some just on the shelf. And we are starting to learn a lot more as we learn more about these different species in our gut, of ones that can help in certain disease states. There's certain species, probably the two most common we see in probiotics are bifida species and lactobacillus. And for example, there's certain bifida species that are good for irritable bowel syndrome. There's also kind of interesting yeast that you can buy called Saccharomyces that's really good for protecting the gut if you take an antibiotic. So we are starting to understand a little bit more that certain species can be helpful for certain disease conditions. As a general rule, if you're going to take one, though, most of the time there are some exceptions. It is best to get one that is refrigerated. Usually the higher the colonies, the better as well. These things tend to be kind of expensive, so you're going to spend $20, $30. Getting one that's, I've seen up to 100 billion colonies, but probably at least 10 to 50 billion colonies is helpful. And then usually when you look on the box too, a lot of them do have various species. Sometimes getting a broad spectrum one can be helpful, at least as a way to start. Probiotics aren't meant to be taken forever, though. A lot of times people feel they need to take them all the time. They really are kind of a way to sort of feed the bacteria, get things going, but not meant to be something long-term. Like Heidi said, really the best long-term is getting into, fermented foods, fibers, a lot of fruits and vegetables, foods of color. But probiotics can be helpful in certain situations. There are some that are very helpful, like for Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, some of those inflammatory bowel diseases. But sometimes it can be helpful for a boost just for taking a few months as well.
Yeah, perfect. And Heidi, I know with some of our patients so far, you've recommended some soil-based probiotics.
Right.
I know that one company that we use, we get a lot of patients will put them through Full Script, which is our online dispensary that we're going to talk more about. But on there's a company called Megaspore, and they do a lot of the soil-based. Do you have any thoughts on the soil-based that you can just kind of throw at why you recommend those?
Well, sure. And I think that the spores are just, they're pretty shelf stable. I mean, and I think you're going to find those more from vegetables naturally, we wash them, but there's still going to be some healthy, it's like in vegetables that are grown in healthy soils are going to come with some of their natural probiotic. And that's why fermenting foods, you just really foster the growth of those bacteria. So yeah, those soil-based probiotics are typically like bacillus and are, really emerging in research and certain benefits for the gut. I think we need a little more data on some of it, but I think it's safe and we find it in food. And so there's some good data coming out for sure.
Yeah, that's great.
Skin conditions, stuff like that, benefit.
Yeah, we've definitely seen benefit with that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, when we do have to recommend an antibiotic for somebody, when we were more practicing in our conventional roles, one big thing I think I get a lot of questions about is, so I should take my probiotic the same time as the antibiotic. And that's just not true. I try to explain to patients that actually, if you take the probiotic while you're taking an antibiotic, the antibiotic you're taking will kill those bacteria. So we don't want to waste those spendier probiotics. So what we have people do is get through their antibiotics if they have to go on them. And then we recommend people being on a probiotic for about a month at minimum after they finish the antibiotic. Again, like Heather mentioned, Saccharomyces boulardii, and it has a lot of research behind it supporting the use during antibiotics. So it is actually a yeast-based probiotic, and it just helps set up a healthy microbiome. So it keeps your microbiome in check when you are taking an antibiotic that can disrupt it. And again, you can take the Saccharomyces at the same time as an antibiotic. So I like putting patients on Saccharomyces if they have to go on the antibiotic, and I'll have them continue it for about a month after. And they can also add in other probiotics that have the bifidobacter and the lactobacillus containing in them, and they can take that in addition for another month. So yeah, that's kind of, as probiotics are a big topic, which is why we had a lot of answer for that one, just because there's so much thought behind it, and there's new research, like Heidi's saying, more and more keeps coming out. So yeah, I think that hopefully answers the question there. But okay, here's another question that just came in on the chat box. So are there foods besides sugar that are not good for the good gut bacteria? And I'm not sure who did, maybe Heather, did you mention this? She said, pretty sure you had mentioned hand washing dishes.
Yeah, and maybe I can answer both. So yeah, just quickly about the hand washing the dishes, it kind of gets back to the idea of it's okay to have your hands dirty. I think sometimes, and it's interesting time right now with obviously all the sanitation going on with coronavirus, but the more exposed we are to different organisms, like just with dirty dishes in a way, and certainly obviously when you're finished, you want to wash your hands, but kind of having your hands in those dishes, a lot of that bacteria from eating, it can really be helpful. Like I said, sometimes we can almost sterilize ourselves too much, and it's just finding that right balance. Playing in the dirt, letting your kids kind of get a little dirty here and there. There's, looking at having pets around, can be helpful, just especially early in life, the more we're kind of exposed. But even as we get older, like I said, it's sometimes, doing some things the old-fashioned way can be helpful and keep our gut bacteria healthy. As far as other foods besides sugars that are problematic for gut bacteria, and some of it too, not just sugars, but like especially processed sugars are really probably the worst. But also when we cook meats, whether it's processed meats, artificial additives in those types of things can be a problem. When you cook meats on the grill, that black char can be also very problematic. What's actually interesting, a tip is if you are going to eat something like that, let's say hamburger, it's kind of got those black marks on them, actually pairing that with avocado can help buffer some of the effects of that. But definitely, the more something is processed, the more likely it's going to be a problem for the bacteria, because it's foods that the bacteria really haven't seen before. So as they're trying to process it, it kind of turns into these substances that don't quite look right, and then this actually can in turn start to cause inflammation along the gut lining, that leaky gut, and then inflame the immune system too, like we've talked about, or get the immune system going, things that the gut really hasn't seen before. So that's, again, the more natural things, the more natural our foods, more organic, kind of out of the soil, the better.
Yep, I think that's a good summary. So hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, just go ahead and throw another one just to clarify anything in the chat box there. And then another one is, it was mentioned that can be yeast overgrowth. Heather, do you mind talking about what the symptoms of that look like? The question was, what are symptoms of yeast overgrowth? So.
Yeah, yeast overgrowth is interesting. Yeast does play a role in our normal gut bacteria. We have normal amounts, and we also talked about the Saccharomyces, being a probiotic that can be very helpful too. But just like we were kind of mentioning the garden and having everything in balance, if, for example, with antibiotics or if we eat too much sugars, sometimes it can just change that consistency of the bacteria, and it can actually be more favorable environment for yeast to overgrow. And when that happens, it can actually cause a lot of symptoms. I've many a time had people come in with a collection of symptoms. We've done a stool analysis, and it's yeast overgrowth is the main issue. And once we work through that, it helps quite tremendously. So definitely some of the symptoms can include bloating, diarrhea, gas, so all those things that would look like irritable bowel syndrome. But yeast can also affect mood. It can cause irritability. It can affect the skin. Sometimes you can have just some weird rashes or bumps that you're not really sure what they are. That can be yeast. Itchy ears is an interesting symptom that will pop up quite a bit, and just itching in general. A lot of times folks do tend to feel itchy and, don't necessarily know why. That can be yeast. Sometimes joint pain, it can present as more pain and inflammation in joints. So it can really cause a lot of different symptoms. And sometimes that can, like I said, it can be hard to figure out. And again, really looking at the gut and seeing these imbalances can, really play a huge role in trying to figure out someone's issues.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. And another question came in is leaky gut easily treatable, reversible if the issues are corrected? So I guess I can speak to this one because I would say, depending on what the person has going on and what the triggers are, that's going to show us if it's easily corrected or reversible. Like in my situation, I had leaky gut, and I was able to find, through different various mechanisms like I discussed, I was able to find my trigger. I could remove my trigger, and then I redid the testing just to see if I was any better, and I felt a million times better. But sometimes I like the little bit of proof just to show myself, since I'm such a science mind. But that did come back showing that I was so much better. So yeah, I mean, you really just have to look for that root cause, which is the main thing. I mean, this is the mainstay in functional medicine, is that we look for the root cause of what's going on. And we know that there's a potential. I mean, there's so many people who have leaky gut. So we kind of go into our patients sort of with a curious wonder, are they going to have leaky gut as part of their issue? Because if we don't fix that, then if that is happening, then we're going to be running in circles. So we really try to get down to then heal that gut first, if it looks like that's what needs to be happening. And a lot of people coming in with certain symptoms, I mean, that it does tell us, we need to start in the gut. And, through all our functional medicine training, it's begin in the gut. I mean, health just really, truly begins in the gut. So yes, we can get to the bottom of what people have going on, even if it's abstract symptoms. Like I would have never in a million years said that my migraines were from gluten. I would have had no idea until I started down my own path, researching, reading, and learning the processes behind the mechanism of why that would be. And then it all now it just makes absolute perfect sense. But for a long time, it just didn't. And it wasn't something, even as a medical professional, that I would have turned to first. But with functional medicine training, it was definitely a first place for us to go. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But it is something that we look for, of really getting that gut healthy, really improving the health of the microbiome, finding the triggers that are causing inflammation, helping utilize if there's any supplements, foods, anything that can help reduce inflammation, hitting that lifestyle, so stress management, appropriate movement for the person's body, social connections, sleep, all the different things that we're talking about really in this whole series that can get people back on track. So yeah.
And I guess maybe I'll just say one quick thing. I know we've got a few more questions there, but and I think it's important too, as we get more proactive, and we mentioned it in the talk tonight, but some of us are genetically predetermined to react more to certain foods. I think celiac is a prime example. Certain genes that if you were to see that big gluten protein make you more likely to react. And hopefully as part of this process with functional medicine, we can kind of know that early. We can, whether it means you need to avoid gluten early or really make sure we're protecting that gut, catching signs of early of leaky gut. Because sometimes in the setting of celiac, if it's been going on for a long time, like Lindsay was showing the fingers and the microvilli, you really do lose a lot of that and can have, a lot of damage, which in that case may be hard to, you can still do some repair, but it may be difficult, more challenging. So, I think the key is finding the root cause, but just this is such a more proactive approach. We're not just treating things once it's already happened and the damage is done. It's really trying to get on top of things as early as possible.
Yeah, thank you for adding that because it's a super important point. Another question is there anything new regarding histamine intolerance? And I think, Heather, you definitely could talk about this.
Yeah, it's interesting with histamine intolerance, a couple things with that. So this is also, to a degree, genetically predetermined of how we handle histamine. There's certain enzymes that handle histamine processing in our bodies. There are definitely foods that are high in histamine. And what's a little tricky about this is some of these foods are really healthy, like avocado and certain nuts, sometimes the fermented foods, things like sardines and certain fish, so that can be an issue. And back to kind of gut bacteria imbalances and dysbiosis, there are certain species of bacteria, if present in higher numbers of what they should be, actually tend to like to process histamine more, which can create more histamine issues. So again, it's kind of going that root cause. It could be some genetics, which can, if there's an issue with the enzymes, that can be supported. It may have to be tweaking the diet, very specific to histamine related foods. And then again, going back to balancing the gut bacteria.
Yep. I think that's great. And then another question came in that is gluten bad for the gut?
Yeah, I guess I can address that one, and I think we can say a lot of the times yes, because all the reasons you guys both mentioned, that it can in and of itself be causing a leaky gut, allowing in bacteria that don't belong, or allowing in substances, inflammatory compounds to be made in the body. And I myself have experienced that. And I had a skin condition that I've had my whole life. And if I would have known when I was a teenager, I think I would have felt a lot better about myself knowing that. But I had these awful, almost like wounds. They wouldn't heal, all over my back. And you might call it acne, whatever you want to call it, but they would never heal, or months and months. And gluten was and is still today the main trigger. And there's no way I would have known without really giving it a good try of eliminating. And so long story short, yes, it does affect our gut health, and it can affect a lot of things. And we don't really know why gluten is such a big deal today, but there's a lot of speculation as to how crops are grown, chemicals used, the strains. There's about 4 times more gluten in today's wheat products than there was even 50 years ago. So there's a lot of reasons we could benefit. Does everybody benefit from a gluten-free diet? No, but many people could. So it's worth exploring. So I don't know if does that answer that?
Yeah, I think it totally does. I think it's some good points. And I think that, it's definitely just one of the top allergens that we know, not in everybody, like Heidi said, but in a lot of people can cause symptoms. And it doesn't have to just be gut-related symptoms if the gut is affected, but it can kind of bleed over into this a systemic effect like Heidi was dealing with. And I had direct gut effect, but it actually bled over into symptoms for me, like I was saying, migraines and some different pain areas. But yeah, I think that it's something to explore if there are some unknown symptoms going on. I think it's definitely something to look into, and that's kind of why it is a known trigger for inflammation. So it is part of those top allergens we remove when we do the elimination diet. And next week, we're going to talk a lot more about the elimination diet in detail and just give an overview on that, because it is such a detailed process, and it's, a free test that we utilize to figure out, again, triggers that might be causing inflammation for people and leading to unwanted symptoms. So it's not bad for everybody, gluten in general, but I think it's, what I remember reading and hearing in some functional medicine lectures we've done is that not one person really absorbs or can tolerate gluten per se, but it's just how the person actually reacts to that intolerance of it. So some people with celiac will react pretty severely, and that even varies within the celiac realm, from mild to severe. And then there's other people that just have sensitivities to it. And it just kind of, I think it just varies in general. So yeah, it's something that we remove knowing that it's an issue, but again, there's plenty of people that eat it and they, may not suffer big consequences from it. So it's just, I think it's just per person, again, personalized medicine. So, yeah, so hopefully that answers that. And then, I think we probably have time for maybe like 2 more questions. You guys think? I think we're kind of almost to that time, but we can do a couple more. So, one question is, do you believe in food allergy testing? And I will jump into that one because, I've done that myself, but it's something that we do look into for patients. And it's something that can just give us another piece of the puzzle. So we don't rely on it completely because it's not always 100% accurate, meaning that it just doesn't say, yes, you definitely have this allergy, you definitely have that allergy. Food allergy testing can be beneficial because if you have a lot of foods that you're quote unquote reacting to that is positive on the test, it does show us that you likely have a leaky gut presentation going on. And so it's also hard in food sensitivity testing because like on mine, I had, barley grains, but I didn't have wheat, which was really confusing. So while that was, helpful to see that, and it does point to potentially, that's one major reason I removed gluten on my elimination diet, is because I had that, and it's because it's a top food allergen. But basically it's, when we have those things showing us that, we really need to move into that second phase of identification, which is that elimination diet. And so if we put those 2 things together, it really does paint an amazing picture for us to know what is going on with the patient and what foods can they tolerate and what can't they tolerate. And for me, I had on my food sensitivity test, it showed paprika, and I would have never, ever found paprika on a elimination diet just because it's not, it's a nightshade, but it's not, readily part of, some of those elimination pieces that we do. So it was good for me to find that out on that blood test. So it is something that we do believe in, but I do not think in and of itself, it is something that should be solely relied on at all. So we'll get into more food allergy testing and intolerances and sensitivities next week because it is such a hot topic and there's a lot of home test kits out there. And we've just gotten a lot of questions about, should I order this? And it's something that, again, we like to think about and potentially use as part of the puzzle, but there's a few more things we like to add to it. So it's not the only thing just because it is highly confusing at times, but yeah, there's that. And then another question came in of how much fiber do you recommend daily? And
Yeah,
Heidi, do you want to do that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's highly dependent, but on the person, size, body size, bowels, but 25 to 35 grams in there. And Heather, did you have any other comments? I know maybe you wanted to add to that.
Oh yeah, same thing. Women can get away more on the 25 grams. Men need 35. I think like you had said, most people don't even come close to that. There are other societies that, are getting 50 plus grams a day, and kind of it just as a rule is for a typical vegetable or even fruits, let's say an apple or, a cup of fruit, you're probably going to get about 3 to 4 grams. I think chia seeds, flax seeds, like Heidi mentioned, same thing. And so if you start kind of doing the math, one of the things we really push is, like we've already talked about, is a lot of foods of color and fruits and veggies. And so if you can kind of get up to those 8+ servings a day, then you're starting to hit on probably a lot of fiber and but variety, getting not just the veggies and the fruits, but, nuts, seeds, those types of things as well.
Perfect. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come through. So if that's the case, I think we'll probably just end it there. But we really appreciate you being here this week and watching us again. And tell anybody else that you think's interested. If they missed it today, it's no problem, because again, we're going to be putting it on YouTube and then on our website as well. So yeah, go ahead and check that out. And next week we'll be here again. And Heather, do you mind talking about what we're going to cover then?
Yeah, so next week we're going to get more into, food. Well, we'll talk some about tonight with food and how it affects the immune system and gut health, but we're definitely going to get into that a little more next week. Like I said, more details on the elimination diet. We're going to go into, it's kind of fun. We'll do kind of an analogy of how sugar really affects the gut and how it can cause local inflammation, leaky gut, get into some more details about food's effects.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. We are super happy to have you here.
Yes, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
We'll see you next week.